All right, I'm going to get this started up and start going through things. I've got a number of questions that have been emailed in that I'm going to touch on at the end, but let's go ahead and dive in. So, why do we like individual bonds? The biggest thing when we talk about bonds and what I'd like to get across in this particular session is they make a lot of sense and they allow us to add predictability to the uh, overall portfolio, especially whatever allocation that we have going on in the fixed income. And so it's going to be a real high level look of just kind of that practical way that we approach fixed income and why individual bonds, I think, are so much more important than people realize. The thought process being, well, why don't we just buy our bond fund and move on? So what's the difference? So with individual bond, we're owning a specific bond with a defined maturity. You know that if you hold it to maturity, that you're going to get all your money back. And so as long as the business doesn't, go out of business, you get all of your money back, regardless of where the money flows during the time period. So if we bought a $10,000 bond, hence 5-year bond, and in year 2, it's worth $12,000. In year 3, it's worth $8,000. Goes to 15. Still, it ends up being one of those things that the maturity date comes around, business is still in business, we get all $10,000 back, plus we've gotten our interest over the time period. Bond fund is basically exactly like a stock fund in that it owns a whole bunch of different bonds together, and you get your prorated portion of that performance. And so there's no maturity date for you. Each bond inside the fund has a maturity date, and the yield can change dramatically. So there's not a lot of predictability there. They try to keep it within a range, but in general, as the bonds move in and out of the portfolio, that's what determines your yield. And you have no control there either of how much. So the prospectus on the bonds, so the governing document, kind of gives you a rough idea of how that's going to work, but it's not guaranteed. So for all those reasons, predictability of income, maturity value, volatility is a big thing. So we know, I find a lot of comfort anyway in the ability to tell a client that, hey, that bond is going to mature, so let's just sit tight. We know it's going to come back around. You don't know that that's the case on a fund. You can control your credit and your duration. So I can decide, do I want to be in high yield? Do I want to be in AAA bonds? Do I want to be some mixture of those? I can more directly make that allocation. And so you can match the bonds to your goals too. So we always hear about like CD ladders or bond ladders. So you can choose your maturity date so that you're always having money come due when you need it, instead of having to buy and sell a bond fund when you need it, which may or may not be advantageous timing. And so, there's 4 big buckets of bonds. There's a lot more than this, but you've got treasuries from the government. So, as long as the U.S. government is solvent, I realize that's not necessarily always going to be the case, and the world seems to be changing quite frequently, but still, as of right now, the most guarantee in the world. CDs from banks. So we've got, the banks with the FDIC insurance, so you can get up to $250,000 in a bank, and you're getting your money back even if the bank goes underneath. Municipals are just state and local bonds. So, for example, Kingsport goes out and wants to build a new highway or a road or something of that ilk. They might issue a bond, and then the people who buy that bond get the yield from the city of Kingsport. And the thing about those are that they're not taxed federally, and Tennessee doesn't have a state tax. But if you were in a state like New York or California, which have high state taxes, buying those municipal bonds make a massive difference in your overall tax picture. And then corporates, so just businesses. if we go out and buy a Johnson & Johnson bond or a Walmart bond or a Kraft Heinz bond, so you can do a lot of different things there so you can get better returns, and choose where in the credit cycle you want to be. There are places, though, that bond funds make sense. And so one of the things would be if diversification is hard to achieve directly. So think about those accounts that are just starting to build their value. Pretty much, you have to have at least $1,000 to get a bond that makes sense. But sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes based upon how you're wanting to build a portfolio, it might make sense to get all of your diversification in one bond. So even at $1,000, unless you're going to buy like a treasury, you might want to spread that out through a bond fund to get the diversification. But as soon as the account builds to a size where we can start layering in individual bonds, that's something that we very heavily like to do. Other things that we'll do is look for specialized areas or tactical areas. So it might be going into the private credit market or going into the high yield market or going into a very particular strategy within the bond market that we're going to trust those fund managers who are playing in that arena every day to do that. But one thing that, I give bond funds credit where it's credit's due, because they don't have a maturity, they're constantly reinvesting. And so if you turn on dividend reinvestment, interest reinvestment, as those bond funds pay their dividends, you're going to get that, next year in, and you dollar cost average, and it works out really well. And there are some places where that, from a tax perspective, can create tax losses, but overall gains. So it's not uncommon for us to have put, $10,000 into a bond fund, and it shows up as a tax loss, even though we have $15,000 worth of that bond fund now, just with the way the dividend reinvestment works. But I wanted to go through kind of a case study. So this is an actual bond that we bought versus an actual fund. And so if you look kind of on the left side there, so we bought a Home Street Bank bond, 6.5%. We bought this back in August of 2020. Has a maturity in, coming up next year. It had the 6.5 coupon. We paid a premium for that. So that purchase price of 106, that's going to mature in 2026 at 100. So we knew in advance that we were going to lose $6 on that, but we did that on purpose. That high coupon, that 6.5, when we were buying these in 2020, interest rates were a little bit lower. So it averages out better. To pay a little bit up front and give it up on the back end, but we know no matter what, we're only going to quote unquote lose that $6,000. But when we look at the annual income, it's $6,500 a year. So if we look, from when we bought it to today, we've had about $3,200 or $32,500 worth of interest. Its current value is still actually very close to par, or very close to our purchase price at 105. So our net return is 32,111. So that's a 5.4% annualized return during that same time period. If I went back to the same day and I said that same $100,000 and I bought bond fund, it would be very typical if you bought like the Vanguard Total Bond Fund to represent the entirety of your bond portfolio. At that time, it was trading at $88.59 a share. We could get about 1,128 shares. We're a little under $100,000, but for the math, it's as close as we're going to get. So our income during that time period, on average, I went back and looked at the dividend payouts, was only about $2,112. So we've only earned on that same purchase $11,562. Current value, though, it's dropped tremendously in value as interest rates have risen. And the current value is only $80,088. So net return, we're down $8,000. And so that's roughly 1.5% per year since then. And that's where there's no maturity. So when we bought Vanguard Total Bond, it might have had a similar overall duration to that bond that we bought the Home Street bond. But because it never comes down in duration, it always stays out there in that 6, 7, 8 years. It's not holding value near par. And as interest rates have risen, it's gotten hit. So this has been a prime situation of saying, yeah, the individual bond makes a lot more sense than owning a bond fund. Short duration bond funds have done better than long duration bond funds, which is typical when we see interest rates rise. But we know exactly what we're getting when we buy the individual bonds. So that's the big part of why we like buying individual bonds. And so, yeah, bottom line, provide more stability and income. We don't have the surprise of thinking, if we knew, going back to our previous example, that 5 years ago we had said, hey, we need $100,000 to be able to make this upcoming purchase. We're 20 grand short on the BND versus being where we're at on the bond that we actually know will mature. So it just gives us that control, that predictability, and the cash flow. We'll pause there and pull up a few questions that got sent in my way. Let's see here. Nope. Make sure I go here. We'll stop sharing that screen. We'll go over. So these are ones that got emailed in, and I thought these in particular were very good. Doesn't matter which account holds the bonds, absolutely. So depending upon the type of bond that you have, you want to make sure that you're holding it in the right account. If you've got a municipal bond, which is tax-free, it makes 0 sense to actually own that in a retirement account, which is already tax-free. So you want that in an individual or a joint account or something that's in a tax situation where you're trying to avoid paying taxes on there. And so that's a big part of it. And the other thing is in looking at even between two IRAs. Let's say you only had a Roth IRA and a 401k, because the Roth is growing tax-free and the Roth and the 401k growing tax-free, and one is going to be taxed on the way out and the other isn't. We want high growth things in a Roth and less growthy things comparatively. Hopefully it's still growing a lot in the individual. So we would, if I had $100,000 split between those two accounts, and let's say I had a 50-50 allocation, I'm going to put 50,000 of stocks in the Roth and 50,000 of bonds in the 401k. So it does make a big difference, and that's why it makes sense to sit down and talk about it and see what all is going to make the most sense. If I need to sell before maturity, does that make an individual bond risky too? Yes, they can fluctuate. So if we have to get out early, then absolutely. But you do have a little bit more, actually, I would say a lot more predictability and choice in how you're going to do that. And when we're building bond portfolios, we're always trying to have kind of that ladder effect of multiple bonds on top of each other so that we're close always on at least some portion of the money can be liquidated. But yeah, if you buy a bond at par, so we pay 100 for it, and it's 2 years into a 10-year bond, and interest rates spike, and that bond's worth 90 right now. Yeah, it has that risk, but so would the bond funds. So it's not exclusive to individual bonds. And you're trying to make those decisions based on your goals. And then the last one that came in is bond funds seem easier. Why go through all this trouble? That's what we're here to do. That's really kind of from a perspective of, it's a place that I feel like we can add a lot of value to somebody's portfolio without adding any extra risk, with having more stability. And if you're doing it on your own, yeah, keeping track of maturity dates, keeping track of what's going on in the interest rate market, keeping track of all those things, it's very similar to the idea of, isn't owning the S&P 500 better than owning individual stocks? Well, maybe, but I'm sure glad that I've owned Apple and NVIDIA and Microsoft and the ones that have outperformed the S&P 500. this is just a way to outperform the bond market. So when we're looking at that balancing act of safe versus risky, and once we get into the allocation towards the safe side, we're wanting to do it in such a way that we really can maximize that value. And that's why having an advisor who's saying they're doing those individual bond trades can make such a big difference. Those were the questions that got sent in. So thank you so much if you sent one of those in. I think, they really hit some of the topics that are super important. And as always, if anybody has any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're going to keep doing this stuff. And I think over time, it's been proven that it makes such a massive difference to overall return.